October 5th, 1996, was a sleepy Saturday in Denver, Colorado. 35-year-old mother of three, Terri Turachak, had stayed out late the night before as her kids were away. Yet no one in her apartment building noticed that her front door lay ajar all through the morning. It was only around 12:40 p.m. in the afternoon that a neighbor finally saw the open door and went in to check on Terri. Nothing could have prepared him for what he was about to find. Minutes later at 12:47 p.m., Denver PD responded to a 911 call from Terri's building at 1927 East 17th Avenue. When detectives arrived on scene, they found Terri Turachak strangled to death in her bedroom. At that time, investigators had no idea that it would take almost 3 decades for them to find the answers to the mystery. Who could have killed Terri Turachak? And why? Today's case takes us to Denver, the state capital of Colorado, with a population of over 700,000 people. Its economy is largely based on its position as a key link in the country's transportation system, as it's the largest city for 500 miles around. Due to this, it serves as a hub for storage and distribution of goods and attracts people from all over the country searching for work. It also has a number of governmental agencies and large multinational corporations. On the cultural side, the Denver Art Museum is known for its collection of indigenous works. Larimer Square, the city's oldest block, has beautiful 19th century architecture. Denver dates back to the Old West era of the United States, but today it's a bustling metropolis with a thriving economy and rich cultural heritage. And it's here in the melting pot that Denver is that our story begins today. On May 14, 1961, James C. Turachak proudly welcomed his first child, a beautiful baby girl named Terri Turachak, into the world. A military man who served as sergeant in the U.S. Air Force and fought in the Vietnam War, James was a tough but loving father to Terri. Her mother's identity is unknown, but she was not James's only child. A few years after she was born, he had a son, James Turachak Jr. They shared a happy childhood growing up together and were practically inseparable. The siblings always shared a tight bond even as they grew into adults and started their own families. Terri had 3 beautiful children of her own, but their names and their father's identity remains unknown. Her brother James remembers her as being a great mom to the kids. In 1996, at the time of her murder, Terri was 35 years old and living in Denver at 1927 East 17th Avenue. Terri was in a relationship with a man whose identity remains unknown, but she also had other dalliances on the side. While it may not have been amazing, Terri's life appeared to be going all right. She had her friends and family and was doing her best to make the most of her situation. Little did she know what fate had in store for her. From what's known, Terri Turachak went about her regular routine that Friday. After work, she returned home, finished up some chores around the house, and then got ready for a fun night out with her friends. Although we don't know where exactly they went, we do know that her children were not staying at home at that time, which meant Terri had the place to herself. At around 8 p.m., she left the house and headed out, ready for a fun night out. Reportedly, a neighbor saw her returning to her apartment building around 11:30 p.m. Saturday was a sleepy start to the weekend. Terri's apartment door was left suspiciously open, but it took until after midday at around 12:40 p.m. for a neighbor to notice this and look inside to see if everything was all right. When he called out to no response, he entered the house to check on Terri. He went through the living room and the kitchen, but could find no sign of her. He then cautiously approached the bedroom. As he entered her room, he was horrified to find Terri lying face down on the floor. He rushed out of the apartment and dialed 911, stunned at what he'd seen. Soon after, sirens blared down the street, and police cars pulled up to the apartment as officers responded to the call. Homicide detectives Joe Tennant and Joe Dermott from the Denver Police Department took the lead on the case. Upon arriving, they cordoned off the apartment as an active crime scene and got to work. They discovered signs of a struggle in the bedroom where Terri's body had been found. They also learned from neighbors that there had been some sort of disturbance in the victim's apartment between the hours of 1 and 1:30 a.m. in the early hours of that day. There were no signs of forced entry into the apartment, and it seemed like the killer had just walked out and left the door open as they were leaving. When they spoke to other residents in the building, they learned that no one had seen anyone leaving around that time. Dr. T. Henry was the medical examiner at the scene and who also later performed the autopsy on the body. He found that Terri's cause of death was strangulation, and she also had signs of blunt force trauma to her head and face. While performing the autopsy, he recovered suspect hair from her right thigh, which detectives believed came from the killer. He also found evidence that she'd been sexually assaulted prior to her death. The case was ruled a homicide, and the detectives set off to find the killer. The detectives started their investigation by interviewing Terri's friends and family, as well as other residents in her building, to find out if anyone knew anything or had seen or heard something suspicious happening to Terri. They learned a number of strange details about the night that Terri had been killed. The neighbor who had seen Terri entering the building around 11:30 p.m. on October 4th said that she was not alone, but had entered with an African-American man who had an afro. Another neighbor said that they'd heard a commotion and raised voices coming from Terri's apartment at around 12:30 a.m. that night. Yet another neighbor stated that around 1 a.m., Terri had come to the door of her apartment building asking for money. She appeared to be injured at the time of this incident. The neighbor who heard the commotion coming from her house had also seen that her apartment's door was left open at 3:30 a.m. when he left to pick up his girlfriend. According to these accounts, detectives surmised that Terri had been killed around 1:30 a.m. They also spoke to Terri's boyfriend at the time, whose name has not been released to the public, and found out that on the night of the murder, he did not meet her and had been spending the night at his mother's place, which his mother confirmed. He also told the detectives about a week before the murder, on September 30th, 1996, he'd been visiting Terri at her apartment when they were robbed and assaulted by 3 unknown African-American males, which they'd later reported to the police. With all this information, police now had plenty of leads to follow. They were especially interested in the unidentified male who had accompanied Terri to her house that night of the murder. And what situation had led to Terri asking her neighbor for money in the middle of the night? Was it something to do with this strange man? Was it connected to the robbery that had taken place a week before her death? The police followed all these leads and more, but could not find anything concrete. They had one suspect who they took in to be interrogated and even conducted DNA tests on, but his DNA did not match the DNA that they'd found on Terri's body. With the leads drying up, eventually the police had to move on to other cases. The investigation fizzled out, and with no trail for them to follow, the case went cold. In August 2004, the investigation was reopened when suddenly, after 8 years, the CODIS DNA system suddenly hit a match for the DNA evidence found on Terri's body. By this time, Detective Dixie Crimes was made the lead detective on the case. The CODIS system had provided them with a match of an offender who was already within the system, an African-American male named Ricky Dawson, who was 43 years old at the time. Born on January 24, 1961, he'd been 35 in 1996 when Terri had been killed. The team of detectives re-examined the case files and the interviews conducted by the original investigation to see if this man had been mentioned, but they found no sign of him. He did, however, match the description of Terri's companion from the night of her murder that her neighbors had mentioned. They pored over the information available and went through all the evidence the original detectives collected. When police looked further into him, they were shocked to find the trail of crimes he had left behind. His DNA was in the system because he'd been convicted for second-degree murder in 2001 for a case in Florida. His DNA had also been found in a sexual assault and murder case in Seattle from 2000. The case showed signs of manual strangulation and blunt force trauma, exactly like Terri's case. The Seattle police had not confirmed his guilt, but in 2004, he was a suspect in this case as well. At the time, he was also serving a 25-year sentence at the Suwannee Correctional Institution in Florida for the second-degree murder charge that he'd been found guilty of. They checked his criminal record in Denver as well and found that he'd been arrested for 2 minor crimes in Denver around the time that Terri was killed. In December 2004, the detectives went to interview Dawson at the Suwannee Correctional Institution where he was serving a sentence. They wanted to ask him what he knew of Terri and his involvement in her death. The exact contents of the interview between the detectives and Dawson have never been revealed to the public, but police did learn of an associate of his who was close to him at the time of the murder. After their interview with Dawson, they next interviewed his associate to learn what he knew. He told the police that he knew Terri well and would often hang out at her apartment. He says the night of her death, he'd been there with Ricky and Terri, and all three of them had been doing drugs. He said he had left at around midnight that night and did not know what had happened after. Following this, the police conducted one final DNA test by testing new samples of DNA they'd taken from Dawson against the hair they'd recovered on Terri's body, and it matched the hair's major DNA profile. Satisfied with this, police could now charge Dawson with Terri's murder. But for whatever reason, perhaps because Dawson still had 2 decades left on his sentence, these proceedings were not set in motion, and the case remained dormant for over another decade. 14 years later, a whole 22 long years after Terri's murder, Detective John McGrail of the Denver Police Cold Case Unit was assigned the case for a follow-up investigation. He reviewed the case file and saw that it was practically an open and shut case. In December 2018, he then submitted the case for additional laboratory analysis regarding the evidence recovered from the scene and the victim's post-mortem examination. In August 2019, the DNA came back as a conclusive match. It was now time to begin to set the process in motion to have Ricky Dawson charged for the murder of Terri Turachak. Finally, on January 26, 2023, an arrest warrant was issued for Ricky Dawson for the charge of first-degree murder. He was still serving his sentence for the second-degree murder charge in Florida and was now 62 years old. He's been extradited from Florida to Denver by the Denver Police Department and was advised of the charges against him on February 23rd. His next appearance in court is scheduled to be on March 23rd, 2023. James Turachak, Terri's brother, was never sure if he would see justice for her death after her murder in 1996. But now, after 27 years, he was overwhelmed with the news of an arrest. He went on to give a statement and said how he had never given up on his sister's case and how real it all became when he learned the culprit was being extradited. Mourning the loss of his sister in such a tragic manner, he continued to say, "Family goes on. It'll never get filled back up. It's a huge chunk that none of us will ever know how it ended up. She would have enjoyed having grandchildren. So much lost. Just a beautiful soul." He says he wants to forgive, but isn't ready to do so just yet. He hopes his sister will get the justice she deserves, and Dawson spends the rest of his life in jail. On September 28, 1979, police received news that told them that they'd received information that a body of a woman had been found at a South Lake Tahoe campground in California. When investigators rushed to the scene, it was a shocking sight. A woman's body was found, beaten and strangled to death. Sadly, they were unable to identify this woman at the time, which made it difficult to proceed with the investigation into finding out who her killer could be. For decades, this case left police scratching their heads until, in the last few years, progress was finally made on the case. Today's story takes us to South Lake Tahoe, a California resort city on Lake Tahoe in the Sierra Nevada mountains with a population of over 20,000 people. A scenic holiday spot known for its beaches, boating, and nearby ski resorts. People come from all over the country, and indeed the world, to experience this desert oasis. The city's restaurants and bars merge enticingly with the casinos of the nearby state line of Nevada. In South Lake Tahoe, Van Sickle Bi-State Park has wooded trails and lake views. Tragically, in 1979, this became the final resting place for one unfortunate soul, and that is where our story begins. On September 28, 1979, the El Dorado County Police Department responded to a report of a body of an unidentified female at a campground in South Lake Tahoe. This call came from a news reporter who had received this information from the 3 individuals who found the body. Strangely, they chose to call him instead of the police. When investigators arrived at the scene, they examined the body and determined that the woman had been strangled to death. They found evidence that she'd likely been chased through the picnic area of the campground, losing her flip-flop along the way. It seemed as though multiple struggles occurred throughout the park. They ruled the death as a homicide, and the investigation commenced. Unfortunately, investigators had no idea who the woman was, which made the investigation a lot more challenging. The police did, however, have a lead. They began by speaking to the 3 individuals who had found the body and asked why they'd reported it to the news instead of the police. They learned that the individuals who had found the body had been unwilling to call the police because all 3 had warrants out for their arrest at the time. When they examined the body and crime scene for evidence, they found that, apart from manual strangulation as the cause of death, the woman also had marks indicating that she'd been beaten prior to her death. Upon testing her body for foreign DNA, they were able to collect a sample that did not belong to her. Upon further investigation, they found a beer bottle near where the body had been discovered that matched the DNA sample found on her body. They tested it against the 3 individuals who discovered the body, but none were a match, so the sample was stored in the hopes that it may be of use later in the investigation. Police then tried everything possible to identify this mystery woman, yet it proved immensely difficult to do so. They released a description of the unknown woman to the public. They also released information regarding her age and the outfit she was wearing when she was found. They hoped that someone would come forward to identify her, but no one did. They then interviewed possible suspects, including criminals with past records of similar crimes who were in the area at the time the murder occurred. However, nothing of significance came of any of those interviews. Despite their tenacity, initial investigations failed to identify the victim. This, of course, was also a major barrier in identifying her killer. The body of this poor woman was buried in a potter's field in Tahoma, California, under a headstone that read, "Unidentified female," in October 1979. The investigation died down soon after with no leads to follow, and slowly but surely, the case went cold. For over 3.5 decades, the case remained dormant. Then, in 2014, investigators with the El Dorado County Cold Case Homicide Unit reviewed the case files and decided it was time to revive the case after all these years. It was time to see if they now had the resources available to solve it. John Gaines was the new lead detective on the case, and he took it upon himself to examine all the information and evidence available from the original investigation to see if there was anything that had been missed that they could use now to identify either the woman or her killer. He learned that the DNA profile that had been found on the victim and on the beer bottle at the crime scene had been uploaded into the FBI's Combined Index DNA System, or CODIS, database. Yet even now, 35 years after the murder, there were still no matches within the system. While re-examining the evidence from the case, Gaines looked at the jewelry they found on her when she was murdered, and he realized that one of the pendants had been misidentified during the initial investigation. It had been labeled as a deer pendant, but Gaines recognized that it was actually a chai pendant, a symbol for life in the Jewish faith. Gaines said he identified it because the famous singer Elvis Presley wore a similar pendant. Gaines now released this new information to the public, sending out pictures of the jewelry in newspapers and online. He even asked for help from the local Jewish community, hoping that someone would identify the necklace and the person it belonged to. In 2015, he finally got lucky. A family from Virginia who believed the pendant belonged to their lost loved one reached out to Detective Gaines. The family reported their loved one missing in October 1979 in Virginia, about a month after the body was found in South Lake Tahoe. After the identification of the jewelry, the next step was to obtain concrete proof that the body did indeed belong to this woman. The police obtained DNA samples from a now 61-year-old woman in Carnegie who believed that the body was likely that of her mother. When they tested this against the DNA of the victim, they finally had an answer. After 3.5 decades of perseverance and patience, they finally had the identity of the woman found dead in South Lake Tahoe in 1979. Her name was Patricia Carnahan. Finally knowing the identity of the victim, investigators were now closer than ever before to solving the case. They began to question her surviving family and look into her past. They needed to see if there was any information available that would help them identify her killer. Patricia Carnahan was born in 1944 in the state of Virginia. The names of her parents are unknown. At the age of 18, she became pregnant with her first and only child, a daughter who was born in 1962. Once her daughter was born, her entire focus in life changed. Her life now centered around this little human who she would do anything in the world for. For the next 16 years, Patricia raised her daughter on her own, with the father wanting nothing to do with her or his child. Finally, in the summer of 1979, her daughter was 17 and Patricia was now 35. She decided her daughter was now old enough to be left on her own with Patricia's family in Arlington County, Virginia, so she could have some time for herself. She took her red Volkswagen bus and drove down to California for a road trip where she could experience the freedom and thrill of the open road. This vehicle was later found abandoned in a car dealership in Venice, California. Her family told police that a few days before her body was found, she called the family and told them she was done with her road trip and would soon be heading home. This was the last time anyone heard from her. They reported her missing about a month later. For the next 36 years, they waited, hoping and praying for any news regarding the missing Patricia. Now finally, though difficult to hear how her life had ended, at least they had some answers. Patricia's body was returned to her family and she was buried in 2015. But still, the killer's identity remained a mystery. For the next 8 years, the case again went cold. Though the identity of the victim was now known, the actual crime occurred so long ago that the police were unable to unearth any new information or suspects. In 2023, as part of an effort by authorities in Washington state to clear a backlog of sexual assault kits, a DNA sample from 1994 matched with Patricia's DNA sample in the CODIS system. Detectives were shocked to discover a match and immediately looked into the 1994 case to find if there was any information regarding the alleged sexual assault that could help them solve the case of Patricia Carnahan. The 1994 case had been deemed unprovable at the time, but the woman involved had named the person she alleged to have assaulted her. The man she named was Harold Carpenter. When he was initially interviewed, he told police that he had consensual sex and that the woman had stolen his wallet. Unfortunately, they had to release Carpenter and cease the investigation when they lost contact with the victim a week later. She's since passed away, according to court reports. Police now had a real suspect for the first time in over 4 decades. They looked into Harold Carpenter's past and what he'd been doing in the decades following Patricia's death. El Dorado County detectives discovered that Carpenter was in South Lake Tahoe in 1979 when Patricia was murdered. He was only 19 years old at the time. Police also learned that Carpenter had been arrested in Susanville, California on September 29, 1979, on suspicion of driving under the influence, just a day after Patricia's body was found. Carpenter was then released to the Bonneville County Sheriff in Idaho, where he completed his sentence on an unrelated burglary charge. A handful of misdemeanor arrests showed them that Carpenter traveled throughout Idaho from 1990 to 1993. Misdemeanor crimes don't usually result in DNA collection, which is why his profile was not in the system. It appears Carpenter settled in Sandpoint, Idaho with his wife for most of the late 1990s before they got divorced in 1998, the same year that he was convicted of domestic battery. Carpenter had a slew of misdemeanor convictions and arrests in Bonner County, Idaho from 1998 to 2018, including possession of drugs, disturbing the peace, reckless driving, and driving under the influence. In 2016, Carpenter was in Spokane, Washington. His criminal past made it difficult to find a job and he was broke, so he soon became homeless. In 2018, Carpenter was the suspect in another rape in Spokane County. And just last year in 2022, Carpenter was also suspected in an unwanted sexual touching incident. He was never arrested in either case, according to court records. From this long, checkered criminal past, it's clear to see that Harold Carpenter was a man with an extremely dark side. This reinforced investigators' belief that he was capable of murdering Patricia. In 2020, he had moved to the Park Tower Apartments, a building reserved for low-income elderly and disabled people, which is where he was residing when the police looked him up in 2023. Police now had their suspect and a great deal of evidence against him. All that was left was for them to find the evidence they needed to charge him. They already had the DNA profile of the killer. All they needed was a sample from Carpenter to test it against. Investigators from El Dorado County obtained probable cause to arrest Carpenter for murder and traveled to Spokane to assist police in the arrest. They surveilled Carpenter for a few days at his apartment in downtown Spokane and tried to obtain the DNA sample. When they were unable to obtain a DNA sample, The El Dorado Cold Case Homicide Unit worked with the Spokane Police Department to arrest Carpenter under a probable cause warrant at his Park Tower apartment. They then took a DNA sample from Carpenter to test against the profile discovered on Patricia's body. The results were a perfect match, which meant that 44 long years after her murder, Patricia Carnahan finally had a chance to receive justice for her untimely death. Carpenter made his first court appearance in Spokane on Tuesday, February 28th. He remains jailed in lieu of $1 million in bail, and the extradition process to have him tried in California has begun. Sadly, he cannot be charged for the 1994 sexual assault case that led to him being identified in this case, because the victim passed away shortly after it occurred. This case is one of the oldest in the country to be solved through a sexual assault DNA review run through CODIS. It's the 13th cold case solved by the El Dorado County Cold Case Team since the unit was started. I'm proud to say our cold case unit is one of the most successful of its kind in the United States. Vern Pearson, El Dorado County's district attorney, wrote in a statement, "With the development of forensic technology, there may be numerous cases like this where killers who have managed to hide for decades will soon be revealed. Families like Patricia's, who had to live without closure for years, can hopefully find some solace in knowing what truly happened."